You're standing on a hillside overlooking chaos. Below you, the greatest army the world has ever seen is collapsing. Elephants in armor are crushing men into the dirt. Thousands of soldiers are turning their weapons on their own commanders. And somewhere in that swirling madness, the Sultan who killed your father is about to die. This is your chance. This is the moment you've waited for since childhood. The tyrant is surrounded. His empire is crumbling. All you have to do is nothing. Just watch. Just let history take its course. Instead, you lower your visor, you signal your knights, and you charge straight into hell to save him. It's July 1402 on the plains of Ankara, and Stefan Lazarevic, the Christian prince who became the Sultan's most feared weapon, is about to perform one of the most incomprehensible acts of loyalty in medieval history. But to understand why he would sacrifice everything for the man who orphaned him, we need to go back 13 years to a field soaked in blood, to a 12-year-old boy standing in a palace courtyard, watching his world end. Before we descend into that darkness, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below. It never ceases to amaze me that we're exploring these forgotten moments together, connected across continents by our shared hunger for the stories that shaped us. The messenger who arrived at Crusaders in June 1389 didn't need to speak. His face said everything. Prince Lazar was dead. The flower of Serbian nobility lay rotting on the field of blackbirds. The Battle of Kosovo had decapitated the kingdom in a single afternoon. Standing in the great hall, too young to fully comprehend what he'd just inherited, was Stefan Lazarevic, 12 years old, suddenly responsible for the survival of a nation that no longer had the strength to defend itself. His father had gambled everything on one battle, believing that God would reward the righteous. God had other plans. But the true architect of Serbia's survival in those first terrible months wasn't Stefan. It was his mother, Princess Milica. History loves to remember widows as weeping figures in black, frozen in grief. Milica was forged from something harder. She saw the predators circling, the Ottomans regrouping in the south, the Hungarians invading from the north, internal rivals sharpening their knives, and she made a calculation that would haunt her family for generations. Serbia couldn't fight two empires, so she chose one to serve. The Ottomans, under the new Sultan Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, offered protection, but the price was unspeakable. First, Stefan would become a vassal, bound to fight for the Sultan when called. Second, and far more personal, was the demand for Olivera, Stefan's beloved older sister. Bayezid wanted her for his harem. Imagine the scene in the courtyard of Crusaders in 1390. This wasn't a wedding procession, it was a funeral march. Citizens lined the streets throwing flowers not in celebration but in mourning. Stefan, barely into adolescence, stood by the castle gates and watched the Ottoman convoy take his sister away. Olivera didn't scream. By all accounts, she went with dignity, her face like stone, understanding that her body was the ransom paid for her country's survival. She was the human shield that stopped the Ottoman advance. For young Stefan, this moment was the forge. He learned his first terrible lesson. Dignity is a luxury, survival is a duty. Months later, it was Stefan's turn to bend the knee. He traveled to the Ottoman capital, expecting death or imprisonment, expecting to join his father in martyrdom. Instead, Sultan Bayezid shocked him. The man who had ordered his father's execution looked at the young prince and saw potential. Perhaps he recognized something of himself in Stefan's eyes, that hunger to prove, to survive, to transcend the hand fate had dealt. Bayezid didn't treat Stefan as a prisoner. He treated him almost as a son. He warned him about the treachery of the Hungarian king. He promised to protect Serbia's borders as long as Stefan remained loyal. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, offering the boy the father figure he had just destroyed. By treating Stefan with respect, Bayezid confused his hatred, bound him not just with chains, but with something far more dangerous: gratitude. Stefan returned to Serbia changed, no longer just the orphan of Kosovo, now the Sultan's protege. And he knew that soon the call would come. The Sultan would march to war, and Stefan would have to draw his sword against fellow Christians. For the next 5 years, Stefan lived a schizophrenic existence. In Serbia, he was the prince, desperately trying to rebuild a shattered economy. But for long stretches, he was a guest or perhaps a high-status hostage at Bayezid's court, receiving an education no European prince could match. He trained alongside the Janissaries, learning the Ottoman way of war. He absorbed the speed and psychological terror of the East and combined it with the crushing power of Western heavy armor. And through it all, he had an unlikely guardian angel, his sister Olivera. In the cutthroat world of the Ottoman harem, where hundreds of women competed for the Sultan's favor, Olivera didn't just survive, she dominated. She became Bayezid's favorite. Ottoman chroniclers later grumbled that she held too much influence, even whispering that she introduced the Sultan to wine, scandalizing the fundamentalists but endearing her to the hedonistic Bayezid. Olivera was Stefan's eyes and ears, the diplomat in silk who smoothed over tensions between her brother and her master. Because of her, Stefan wasn't treated as a servant but as family. Yet this proximity to power came with a sickening realization. He saw the Ottoman war machine from the inside, saw its terrifying scale and efficiency, and understood that European resistance was mathematically impossible without unity, something the squabbling kingdoms seemed incapable of achieving. So Stefan made a choice. He would be the perfect vassal. He crushed rebellions in Serbia that tried to resist Ottoman rule. He paid tribute on time. He provided troops whenever Bayezid demanded. To the patriots in his own land, this looked like treason. To the Catholic Hungarians in the north, he was a collaborator. But Stefan was playing the long game, keeping the wolf fed so it wouldn't devour the flock. The test came in 1396, when the last great crusade of the Middle Ages assembled to drive the Ottomans from Europe. The flower of French chivalry, the Dukes of Burgundy, the Knights Hospitaller, they all marched east, confident and glittering. For Stefan, this should have been salvation. The rescue party had arrived, but reality was more complicated. The Crusaders viewed the Serbs not as allies to be liberated, but as schismatics barely better than the Turks. They were arrogant, undisciplined, marching with wine and mistresses. Stefan compared them to the razor-sharp organization of the Ottoman camp and knew how this would end. At the fortress of Nicopolis on the Danube, the two worlds collided. The French knights, refusing to listen to King Sigismund of Hungary's tactical advice, charged uphill into a trap. They smashed through the Ottoman irregulars and thought they'd won until they crested the hill and found a forest of sharpened stakes and the disciplined ranks of Janissaries waiting in silence. The French horses were impaled. The knights were dragged down and butchered. King Sigismund launched the main Hungarian army to salvage the disaster, and for a moment it looked like he might succeed. The Hungarians pushed the Ottoman center back. Bayezid watched in horror as his lines began to buckle. The great Sultan was minutes from total defeat. This was the hinge of history. If Bayezid fell here, the Ottoman Empire likely dissolves. Constantinople survives another generation. The trajectory of the world changes. Bayezid had one card left. Hidden in reserve behind the tree line waited his Serbian vassal. At the Sultan's signal, Stefan Lazarevic unleashed his heavy cavalry, 1,500 Serbian knights in black plate armor emerging from the forest. But they weren't charging the Turks, they were charging the flank of the Christian army. Imagine King Sigismund's view from inside his helmet, seeing a wall of fresh armored knights descending upon his exhausted troops, seeing the double-headed eagle of the Lazarevic dynasty bearing down like divine judgment. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Stefan's wedge smashed into the Hungarian flank with devastating force, toppling the royal standard. Sigismund fled to a boat on the Danube to escape. The aftermath was nightmarish. Bayezid, enraged by his losses, ordered the execution of 3,000 Christian prisoners. They were brought before him in groups bound by ropes. Stefan stood beside his master and watched as the heads of French and Hungarian knights rolled into the dust. He intervened only once, begging Bayezid to spare a few nobles he knew personally, perhaps to salvage some fragment of his soul. To the eyes of Europe, Stefan Lazarevic was now a monster, the Christian slayer, the man who sold his God to save a tyrant. Monks in Paris and London wrote chronicles cursing his name. But in the silence of his tent, Stefan knew the truth. He had saved Serbia. If he had defected to Sigismund, a man who wanted to conquer Serbia just as much as the Turks did, and they had lost, his people would have been annihilated. By saving Bayezid, he solidified his position as the Sultan's most trusted ally. He bought his country another generation of existence. Yet something broke in Stefan that day. Watching the slaughter of men who shared his faith, he realized the Ottoman appetite for war was endless. He was a hero to the Sultan, a traitor to Christ, and a prisoner of his own success. He needed a way out, but escape seemed impossible. The Ottoman Empire was now at its zenith, held together by the terror of the thunderbolt and the sword of the Serb. It seemed this dark alliance would last forever. Then, in the summer of 1402, history tilted on its axis. From the east came a storm more terrifying than any crusade, a conqueror named Timur the Lame, who built pyramids from human skulls and commanded armies that made the Ottomans look like children playing at war. On the plains of Ankara, the two titans collided. Ottoman discipline met Mongol savagery. Timur's armored elephants smashed through the center. Thousands of Tartar mercenaries defected mid-battle, turning their weapons on their former masters. The invincible war machine of Sultan Bayezid was dissolving. And there, on the right flank, Stefan Lazarevic faced his moment of truth. The Sultan was surrounded, his bodyguards falling, the route to safety cut by a wall of Mongol spears. Stefan could have withdrawn, could have saved his elite troops and watched his master die. Instead, he slammed his visor down and charged directly into the teeth of Timur's horde. 5,000 Serbian knights in heavy black armor, slamming through enemy cavalry with suicidal bravery. From a nearby ridge, Timur, the man who had conquered from Delhi to Damascus, watched this black-clad unit shred his light cavalry. He didn't order their massacre. He pointed and told his generals, "Look, those are not men. They are lions." Stefan cut a bloody corridor all the way to Bayezid. He screamed for the Sultan to flee, offered his own horse, his own life. But Bayezid, paralyzed by pride or shock, refused to move. Stefan had done his duty. He turned his horse around, covered the retreat of Bayezid's eldest son, and fought his way back out of the encirclement. It was one of the greatest feats of martial prowess in the Middle Ages, but it couldn't save the Sultan. Bayezid was captured that day, destined to die in Timur's custody. Some sources say in a golden cage, serving as the conqueror's footstool. The thunderbolt had struck the earth, and the earth had swallowed him whole. For Stefan, riding away from the burning battlefield covered in dust and blood, the world turned upside down. The leash was gone. The master who had controlled his life was now a slave himself. The Ottoman civil war, the interregnum, was beginning, and Stefan Lazarevic was suddenly the only man in the Balkans with an intact army. The lion was loose. He didn't ride straight home. He rode to Constantinople. This detour was diplomatic genius. The Byzantines, who had viewed him as a traitor for years, suddenly welcomed him as a prodigal son. In the hallowed halls of Hagia Sophia, the emperor bestowed upon Stefan the title of despot in Byzantine hierarchy, the highest dignity below the emperor himself. He entered Constantinople as a defeated mercenary. He left as the despot of Serbia, equal in rank to the greatest princes of Christendom. But the journey home was treacherous, the roads infested with broken Ottoman units and bandits. When Stefan finally reached Serbia, he found a people confused and terrified, expecting a Mongol invasion. He arrived not with panic, but with vision. He saw the map of Europe changing, the Ottomans paralyzed by civil war, the Hungarians wary but negotiable. For the first time since Kosovo, Serbia had room to breathe. Stefan immediately began consolidating power, and he did something that shocked the political establishment. He looked north toward his old enemy, King Sigismund of Hungary, the very man he had humiliated at Nicopolis. It sounds insane. Why would Sigismund ally with the man who destroyed his crusade? Because Sigismund was a pragmatist. He saw that the Ottomans were down but not out, and he needed a buffer state. He needed a watchman at the gate, and he knew from painful experience that there was no better soldier in the Balkans than Stefan Lazarevic. In 1408, inside a grand hall in Buda, a ceremony sealed Stefan's transformation. King Sigismund established a new chivalric order, the Order of the Dragon. Its insignia was haunting, a dragon with its tail coiled around its own neck, bearing the red cross of St. George. This brotherhood was designed to be the elite defenders of Christendom. At the very top of the founding charter, listed above kings of Aragon and Naples, above the great magnates of Poland and Italy, was the name Stefan, despot of Serbia. Think about that magnitude. 10 years earlier, he was fighting French knights at Nicopolis. Now he was the first knight of the Dragon. Sigismund didn't just forgive him, he exalted him. To cement the alliance, Sigismund gave Stefan a gift that would define the geography of the Balkans forever, the city of Belgrade. At the time, it was a ruined, neglected border fortress. Stefan saw its potential immediately. Sitting at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, it was the perfect shield for Europe and the perfect heart for Serbia. He unleashed a massive construction project, pouring wealth from his silver mines into the city. Almost overnight, Belgrade rose from the ashes. Stefan built a triple-layered fortress considered impregnable. He constructed a deep-water port, hospitals, libraries. The city gleamed with new white stone walls, literally becoming the White City, Beograd. For a brief shining moment, Serbia wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. Stefan held court like a Renaissance prince, before the Renaissance fully arrived. He hosted jousting tournaments where knights from across Europe came to test themselves. Chronicles describe him during this golden age as possessing eyes that could look at the sun, a man of immense physical stature and gentle manners who could discuss Plato with scholars in the morning and hunt bears with a spear in the afternoon. He had achieved the impossible. He had walked out of the Ottoman fire and donned the shining armor of European savior. But when you build a high tower, you cast a long shadow, and in that shadow his own brother was festering with jealousy. Vuk Lazarevic hadn't saved the Sultan. Vuk hadn't been named despot. Vuk was just the brother, watching from the sidelines while Stefan played the game of emperors. And in the ears of this jealous brother, Ottoman agents began to whisper. They'd promised him an army, half the kingdom, revenge. In 1409, Vuk marched into Serbia at the head of a Turkish army. The Golden Age was suddenly under siege not by foreigners but by family. It was an ugly, grinding war. Brother fought brother. Serbs killed Serbs. Villages that had just begun to recover were burned by their own princes. Stefan was forced to agree to a humiliating partition, tearing his country in half, but Vuk's devil's bargain came due quickly. When the balance of power shifted in the Ottoman Civil War, a new player emerged, Musa Valebi, a psychopath who enjoyed violence for its own sake. Vuk found himself on the wrong side. He tried to flee to Stefan, to the brother he'd betrayed, perhaps hoping for mercy. He never made it. Musa's agents caught him in 1410. There was no trial. The brother of the despot was executed in a muddy camp, his head severed and thrown into a sack. When the news reached Stefan, it brought no relief, only a cold, hard solitude. The Lazarevic family, which had started with a father and brave sons, was now whittled down to one lonely man on a throne. This tragedy hardened Stefan into something terrifyingly efficient. He crushed the nobles who had sided with Vuk. He centralized all power in Belgrade. He was done playing the benevolent prince. He became the autocrat. And to fuel this new centralized state, he turned to the one resource that never betrayed him, the earth itself. Deep in the mountains lay the city of Novo Brdu, today a ruin, but under Stefan's reign, the Dubai of the Balkans, a glittering metropolis of smoke, fire, and coin, producing perhaps 20% of all the silver in Europe. But Stefan didn't just extract wealth, he codified it. In 1412 he promulgated the Mining Code, a legal masterpiece that established clear rules for ventilation, structural support in tunnels, and, incredibly, for the rights of miners themselves.